Word there. All right. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to our Gen AI refresher. I'm Trey Knatzer, Assistant Provost for Teaching and Learning, Director of CELT, and Jill.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Jill Abney, Associate Director for CELT. Excited to chat about where we are with AI, and also for those of you that maybe were hesitant a little bit to learn about it, or maybe just hoping it might go away if you didn't look at it, and have decided that's not happening. This is the place for you.
Yeah, we designed when we came up with our ideas for sessions this semester, we thought it would be good to have a kickoff where, again, we're just kind of making sure we're squared away with, generally speaking, what we're dealing with. It's been a little over 2 years now that generative AI has been with us. It's been about, 2 years and 1 month since CELT started doing any kinds of workshops, town halls, so on about AI. And there have been just a lot of developments, a lot of news, a lot of issues, and it's good to get back to just a solid sense of what we're dealing with, generally speaking, how it works, what the big issues continue to be in education, and kind of what some things we might look out for as we look ahead are. And there's certainly a lot, but we wanted to just kind of keep it short, sweet today. I know it's lunchtime, so feel free if you're eating lunch, just to sort of, you want to keep your camera off, eat lunch, etc. We'll talk through some things, we'll show some demos, and so on. So here's the goals for today. A reintroduction of generative AI. It's been a while, but what does it continue to be? How is it a little different? We all might have some memories from late 2022 of first using ChatGPT and what that was like, but we've had lots of developments. So what is it now? Generative AI, how it works, what it can and can't do, how to use it, and where we're going, what to keep in mind. We'll show some things in demonstrating these different functions and approaches, and leave with some big picture issues for use in education. And we want to leave some chunk of time too for Q&A at the end, because it's kind of hard to cover everything from just a general perspective, and you all likely have some really important questions that we can address hopefully at the end. So we'll start with the what. The what is generative AI? And I think I always like to pause on how we talk about it, how we talk about what it is for ourselves and with our students. That has a big impact in the classroom, not just in the tone that we use, but also in kind of the ways that we understand what it is, and the either analogies or definitions that we might give our students and ourselves. So I actually wanted to just kind of start with if anyone feels so compelled to use just one or two words, maybe, to say, what is, in your understanding, what is generative AI? Just in one or two words. If you have an analogy of what it's like, if you have just a word or two that resonates as to what it is for you, I'd love for you to just put it in the chat real quick, just to dash that off, because here I have, sort of as an example, an article that came out last year around kind of looking at these metaphors for understanding what generative AI really is. So what are those for you, those one or two word metaphors? All right, so scenario builder, idea generator, planner. Okay, yeah. So these are active words, right? Builder, generator, planner, robot writer. There we go, Jonathan. Going right for the robot. That's exactly part of it too, right? So it's a writer, but it's a robot writer. That kind of helps us understand. Synthesizer too. Okay, so things that puts things together in a really kind of compact way. We might return to that idea a little bit. In these kind of understandings here, it kind of shapes how we might use it, how we might think about it. So if we talk about AI as a planner, for example, then we might understand it to be, something that can organize, that can take maybe different sort of information and figure out how to schedule it, or how to apportion it to different efforts, or how to plan it out in a kind of project management sort of sense. But if it's a robot writer, as Jonathan's suggesting, there's a different way of approaching it and understanding that it writes. So it's a writer first and foremost. So we look to it to produce text for us, maybe, but we understand that it's a robot that isn't approaching it in the same way that a human would. For idea generator, as Becca is suggesting, that again shifts how we might treat it and think about it. That this is maybe a creative partner if it's an idea generator. It's something that we might think of first and foremost as something that we would go to for help in brainstorming, but maybe not help in producing things, producing texts or deliverables. And then, yeah, as Bob said, a commodity, right? It's a commodity, and it's something that is deeply implicated in private enterprise and ownership. And that gets us to a whole set of concerns around intellectual property, ownership, access, economics, energy, and so on. All of these are really useful. And this article that I linked to is really interesting. We'll share the slides if you have time to kind of peruse it. It goes through lots of different metaphors and analogies that people have. Others are calculator, for example. I don't know if anyone's heard calculator. It's sort of like a calculator. Others have used the analogy of personal assistant. AI is like my personal assistant. So that might affect how you use it differently then. If it's your personal assistant, you treat it as something that can, you can delegate tasks to, tasks that maybe you don't want to do yourself or not important enough for your time. So you delegate it to your generative AI assistant. And there's all these others in there. Parrot, another one. Parrot is a really popular analogy for AI, which again bears some pretty significant implications that all it's doing is kind of repeating words without understanding in the same way that humans do, as a parrot does. But there's another way, maybe, and I present this option as a way to maybe demystify when we approach engaging with AI, this sense that we're kind of dealing with this alien intelligence when we're using it. And that one analogy or way of thinking of what is generative AI is to say that it's math when we interact with it, which is interesting because we most think about ChatGPT maybe. We think about language models. And so to think about chatting back and forth with a chatbot as ultimately interacting with math is an interesting proposition. But this kind of helps maybe shake us from this feeling that in psychology, particularly, they're interested in of how we seem to be interacting with a human or at least autonomous agent when we're chatting back and forth with an AI. And there's actually a computational linguist named Emily Bender who facetiously uses the phrase mathy math to refer to AIs. And she has a podcast called the Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000, which I highly recommend if you have time, kind of deconstructing a lot of the hype discourse around AI. But I want to say, is it really math? I'm just presenting this as an option. And so this is a way of maybe starting to interrogate how these things work, experience how they work. So I'm going to tab over here to my AI in ChatGPT and just demo a few of the ways that we might think about them. Because if all these different metaphors and analogies are suggesting that we might use them for things other than just like producing text or papers for us, then what are those functions? I'm going to use the latest reasoning model that I have access to just so you can see what that looks like, but I'm going to ask it. I'm going to say that I am proposing that a good way to understand generative AI is that it is math. I want to suggest this to shake people out of the assumption that they are interacting with a human-like agent. Is this, in your judgment, accurate comparison for this purpose? Explain why or not. Let me know about how accurate this is. So we'll see what it's thinking about here. So I'm asking it to reason through things, and it's showing you here its reasoning. This is, okay, and it's producing text pretty quickly here. But ultimately what it's saying is that describing generative AI's math can be useful in some context, but it has both strengths and limitations for your intended purpose. Okay, so it's not just math. So it emphasizes the mechanistic nature to describe it as math because generative AI models are operating on a mathematical model of especially language if we're using something like ChatGPT, where we have probabilities and relationships between different words and tokens. So this is a good thing because it demystifies the process, it focuses on predictability, but maybe this oversimplifies and is a little misleading. So it's telling me that it's neglecting a little bit about the more sophisticated understanding of how a language model works here to say that it's not just math. There are human inputs to this design after you get a language model, when you set it up, and when you train a language model. So, it's not exactly right. There's more going on than just pure math here. And then it's saying appropriateness, it's if my goal is to shake people out of this assumption, then it can be an effective way to describe it. So ultimately, it's saying yes, but it's not exactly sort of perfect at um, conveying how generative AI works.
The place
That's good.
above where it mentioned the analogy avoids talking about the human input
Hmm.
in design is interesting because in that mathematic predictive model or algorithm, the words you put in matter to the outputs, and so that is a fair critique, I think, of the analogy for sure.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Because not only is there the human input and design on the production end, but also on the user end as well, for sure. So how large language models work, and as the ChatGPT model, GPT-o3 was suggesting, it's a fairly sophisticated process that is difficult to be uh, general about, but it's helpful to understand how they work as robot writers, as Jonathan would suggest. How does a robot writer write? How do they approach writing different than we do? And well, it is actually fairly different. And so we have huge data sets of language that are scraped off of the internet. We have them derived from other data sources as well. And there's kind of different names for these massive data sets that these AI developers train their models on, and they learn patterns. And we're talking about trillions and trillions of pieces of data that they learn patterns from that they then use to predict how essentially all aspects of language are related to each other in probabilistic terms. If we're talking about chemistry, for example, that there's certain statistical probabilities in terms of how language works and how one word follows another if we're giving a chemistry presentation on a particular topic versus, there's the kind of old joke about Hallmark movies. And even before generative AI, there's the Hallmark Christmas movie kind of generator game where, the plot's always sort of predictable and sort of generally what the probability is that a character is going to act a certain way or say something, sort of the plot's going to move forward in a somewhat predictable way. So these language models are sort of thinking about words in the same way that if we have an input that a user gives a language model, whether it's asking a question, making an observation, whether we tell the AI to do something, that it's then spinning through a bunch of math to think about what the most likely words are to respond to the query that we just gave it. And those outputs are novel, and that's kind of important to emphasize is that they're not just copying and pasting language in the training data, but rather generating output that is essentially new in a certain way in response to the query that was put in. And so this will be a good opportunity, I think, to look again at how this could work. I'm going to access a what word am I thinking bot here. This is just it's what's called a GPT, but it's basically a persona or a character that I've created using ChatGPT, and it's designed to play a game with people. And this is actually something that you could use whenever you wanted. But it's a challenge game based on how you can predict the next likely word that's coming in uh, a scenario. And so it's telling us that it's going to give us four scenarios to choose from. I'm going to pick one, and then it's going to generate part of a sentence and then stop. It's going to ask me to guess what the next word is going to be. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I want to do the scenario of a professor cancels class unexpectedly. So I'm just going to say one. And so now it's saying that a professor cancels class unexpectedly. It's asking for a difficulty level. I told it to do this. I'm going to tell it to give me a medium difficulty level. And what that means is that you can actually control with these tools a little bit how creative or how typical their guessing can be for which word comes after the other words. So the sentence that we're starting with, students received an email early in the morning informing them that class was unexpectedly, well, I think we know what the next word is, right? Canceled. I'm going to guess that. So it's saying that canceled was indeed one of the top four most likely words to come after that. And so it's the number one. So I got that one right. Okay, it is unexpectedly canceled. Now, the next word, Jill, what do you think the next word is?
I'm gonna say because.
Okay, let's see if it's because. It's not in the top four. We have two more tries.
Okay.
That's
All right.
interesting.
Does somebody
Uh,
want to throw a guess in the chat of what the next word would be based on predictive patterns? Do.
do. Okay, do. Let's try that one.
Wow. Okay.
We have one shot.
Wow. Maybe it's going to
Yeah.
go in the direction of like, well, what's the next step? So how about so don't come. Oh, since.
Okay, so here this is interesting
Huh.
because was in the top four. It just wasn't number one.
Oh, it
Right?
glitched on us. Okay.
Yeah. My instructions to this did not specify that it had to be the number one choice, but it might have
Mm,
understood that. And so because was there as a 30%. And as you can imagine, this could go on and on. We're guessing for each next word. And one of my best favorite descriptions of a computer is a machine that can do second grade math ad infinitum at incredible speeds without ever getting tired, annoyed, hungry, or sleepy. And that's what it does in generating responses based on user input. And that's a really important thing to understand when we get to other conversations around things like whether the output is accurate, whether it's hallucinating, whether it's biased, and why it might be that way, in terms of the mechanics of how the language itself is being constructed here. And there's some guides that think through this a little bit more in long form that I've linked to in the slides as well for further reading. But that's a really critical part in Gen I 101 is to think about how these things are putting language together and how it is a little different than how a person might come up with the words to express a thought because we're not always doing math in terms of how our words might appear in a sentence or a paragraph, and we're not always starting with just the level of the word when we're doing that. So I go
yeah.
back.
And just to reiterate, it's not the goal of the AI to spit out always the number one
Yeah.
predicted word or token or whatever. It's to be stochastic in some way. Like it's based on patterns, but it's not always going to give you the top choice. And so that's why the content is always novel. It's always new. It's not going to give you the same output every single time, even if you're using the same prompt.
I'm just going to say GPT I'm going to go back to O4 or 4.0 and just to demonstrate what Jill's talking about. Stochasticity means that you're random within given parameters. And so I'm going to say, why is it so warm in Kentucky? And so it's always ChatGPT is a little wordy if you haven't guessed. And so now I'm going to open. So notice that I said, why is it so warm in Kentucky? I spelled it out. I'm going to go ahead and remember this first paragraph here. I'm going to open a new chat and say, why is it so warm in KY instead of Kentucky? I'm going to paste here. At the bottom, you can see the original first paragraph and the new one. I asked the same question. all I did was change the word Kentucky to the letters KY. That's it. And so you can see how that stochasticity to where if we had pure probability of the number one most likely thing, then we might expect that the answers be almost identical here. So that's a
Yeah,
good way.
and even if you had used Kentucky as the full word, you still would have gotten some alternative words, I believe, in them.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's always kind of doing that
Yeah.
for sure. So just some things to note about where generative AI is now too, because 2 years ago, if we were giving this presentation of just kind of Gen AI 101, we would assume that basically the way people use it is that you go to the website, you go to OpenAI's ChatGPT, you go to Google's Gemini, you go to Claude, you go to whatever website is hosting the chatbot that you're using, or with the image generators, you go to Midjourney, you go to that website, it's in a browser. This is how it works. But now it's embedded everywhere. And that's one of the things that's very fundamentally different about our current moment, is that it's embedded in lots of software tools, platforms, and devices. And it really can be kind of hidden, or it can be prominent, and it can be just like a little add-on or doohickey to your software, or it could become more of a fundamental mechanic of how a tool works. And just another way of kind of showing that is to show you here that in my actual Google Slides that I'm presenting from, I have a button that's Ask Gemini, and I can just say, given the nature of this presentation, is there anything in my Google Drive that I should include? And so it has access to the slides that it's looking at because it's Google, it's plugged into my Google Drive. It's thinking about everything that's there. And so now it's saying that there's slides from a different slide deck. This says classroom reflections slide deck that might be relevant to this presentation as they also discuss teaching and learning. Okay, so that's just a quick demo, but it shows that this is embedded right in the user interface of Google Slides. And with Apple Intelligence, it's embedded directly in our devices that we have as well. So that's a big change from.
Just so you know, if you're using the g.uky.edu Google accounts that you get through UK, that is not enabled currently. Gemini is not, but if you in a personal Gmail, it is. So if you're wanting to use any of those tools, you won't find them in your g.uky.edu accounts.
Right. And so that's still an uneven landscape as well as to which types of accounts work with which types of tools at which levels of access. Some of the popular tools have remained fairly consistent. If you want a starter pack, it's the big three: ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini. That's your starter pack. There's some others out there that are interesting and new. Mistral is a French entry. It's the sort of the lone European big language model that's out there. Perplexity is another one that is free to access. And interestingly, Perplexity also has loaded in a version of DeepSeek, which is the Chinese model that was recently released, and you can use DeepSeek on American servers. So it's using that model, using it on Perplexity to see how it functions as well. So there's just a lot of options out there, but starter pack, ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini, and just pick one. You don't have to do all three.
I'm going to put an asterisk, like a 3B. I'm going to say Copilot also, because you
Yes.
can use Copilot with your LinkedIn credentials through Microsoft 365. So that if that feels a little more accessible, because it doesn't require you to make a separate account with ChatGPT or Gemini, even though you can access those without signing in now, it just kind of prompts you to do it a lot. Copilot runs a version of GPT or used to. It's probably running something different now.
Right. And so Copilot and OpenAI, I mean, Microsoft owns like 50% of OpenAI. So it's a version of the GPT language models that Microsoft is running under Copilot.
So there's a question in the chat that might be worth addressing real quick before we move to the next step. We're going to talk about where we are with AI right now in just a second, but I do want to share a link based on Adrienne's question, which is other universities have prohibited the use of AI tools by staff and faculty. Does UK have any restrictions regarding use? The quick answer is no, there aren't restrictions. It depends on, though, what your use is. So there is a task force that the provost put together called UK Advance, which has looked at, researched heavily the use of generative AI tools in a number of fields, teaching, research, and clinical care, and generated 3 sets of documents: clinical guidelines, faculty guidelines, and research recommendations. And so it depends on what you're wanting to use it for, as to whether it's appropriate to use it. And these guidelines kind of help you work through it. If you're someone who's using IRB protected data, then if you look at the research recommendations and you go to the Office of Research Integrity, you'll know that there are certain guidelines that you need to mention those tools that you're wanting to use in your IRB proposal, for instance, and they'll tell you whether or not that meets appropriate guidelines. If you're wanting to use it for teaching, we often tell and remind folks, because it's not private, you shouldn't be putting any data that's sensitive in there. So you wouldn't want to put student data into AI for grading purposes or whatnot. Also, there needs to be an asterisk beside whether AI can give you feedback, honest, effective feedback, if you're looking to use it for grading. So we can talk more about what ideas you're thinking through in terms of where and how you want to use it, and whether there's some things you should think about. But it really requires us to be conversant with the tools, what they're able to do, and also the guidelines the institution's putting out. So, all right. Trey, do you mind clicking that next slide? Yeah, so we're 2+ years into generative AI's existence, or at least availability to us masses out here in the real world. And there are some things that are still true. There are some things that were never true. And there are some things that are shifting a little bit. And so we wanted to kind of let you all know about some messages that you might hear, but are more or less true now that AI has gone through a lot of different developments over the course of the last several months. One thing you might hear is that generative AI hallucinates. And of course, that's still true based on the way that Trey showed how it works. It's this predictive model. And so it's guessing the next best word or the next best thing, depending on what media you're asking it to create. But sometimes when it gets it right, it's hallucinating. It's just guessing, right? Based on patterns. So it's still true, but it's not necessarily in how you think. AI is always guessing at the language. And so what we have to do is be pretty careful when you're assessing AI output, taking a look at what's going or what's showing up and how accurate that is. And so I'll give you an example of what I mean. If I asked generative AI to tell me, what was the impact of COVID-19 on college instructors? And it spits out an answer that may sound reasonably accurate. It mentions the stress, the worry about student performance, the inability to motivate students when you couldn't get in communication, etc. That's accurate, right? But you might see in the way that the words are chosen that the phrasing doesn't actually work. Maybe it says something like the upheaval of the pandemic, or the pandemic's implosion, or something where the words are just predicted in a way that doesn't quite mean what you want it to mean. That's one way that you might see a hallucination. There's some other ways too. I'm gonna steal the screen share for just a minute. And actually, I didn't really need to do that to you, Trey, but that's okay. I'll still steal it. Okay. Oh, that's not right, is it?
Got like a hall of mirrors thing there going
Yeah,
on.
no, I'm sure that's really enjoyable for you all. Okay. All right. So one thing that I will show you in terms of, to give you an example of a hallucination, is I asked ChatGPT to generate, and this is an older version of ChatGPT now, asked it to create an image of a robot doing a bench press when I was doing a workshop for health sciences. And this first image was the first one that came up. But that's not a bench press. And I told it it's not being a bench press. I was being pretty coy in my pushback. I could have said specifically like a bench press is whatever, but I didn't feel like doing the labor of teaching it what a bench press looks like. And so the second image is here. That is more accurately an exercise, I would say, but it is still not bench press. That's chest press. And so I asked it one more time, and this was the third image that it gave me. And I like to share this series of images because I believe that it shows what our students maybe don't commit the time or have the confidence to notice in writing if they haven't spent time really scrutinizing the way things are worded, or they don't feel confident in either a subject matter or how they write, then they might miss moments where it's a simple mistake. It's just a difference of a few inches in terms of the bar, but the reality of finishing that rep, of completing that rep, would be not so great for that particular robot. And so the idea that hallucinations still occur is true. Some other things, it can't cite sources. Maybe you've heard that. That is changing. Okay. At first, the earlier models, GPT 3.5, did often hallucinate sources that maybe sounded like something that might exist, but didn't upon further investigation. That is becoming less true as the models are more deeply connected to the internet, and also as other models are becoming more available, like information retrieval models, things like CELT.ai, which I'll put in the chat. There's also a number of others that actually troll databases that they are connected to then pull information. And so you're seeing less and less hallucinated sources. Okay. And many of them will, I don't know if you noticed Trey's encounter with ChatGPT, it even had suggested sources for where it made those connections. Another thing that you might hear is that, well, I can detect it with AI. I can use an AI detector to catch generative AI created text. That was never really true. There are programs out there who will gladly take your money and tell you that there is a 98% chance that they would 98% catch something. Those are not necessarily proven in studies that are beyond their own corporate infrastructure. And probably the more concerning piece of that is some of the AI detectors are harmful in other ways. So students whose first language is not English were being caught more often or accused more often of having AI written text. Students who are using dictation softwares, or students who were using Grammarly were being flagged for AI. And so in some ways, this can actually disadvantage students who are already marginalized in some way. And so there's not a great tool out there. And if you're putting it in a free version, if you're putting student data or your own data in a free version of an AI detector, then there is certainly a very limited amount of privacy and safety around that data. So, Trey, anything to add on AI detectors?
Yeah, it's a very complicated and evolving, and the different detectors work better than others. They tend to work better when it's a case of straight up, copy and paste an entire thing that was generated by AI. But when we think about, all those analogies that you started out with, AI is like this, it's like that, that there's so many other use cases in which it's not just giving you the deliverable, but rather it's giving you input rather than output. It's giving you ideas, it's checking your work, it's suggesting courses of action, it's drawing your attention to other sources. So there's going to be a wider spectrum of uses of AI in the learning process, well beyond the kind of more strict plagiarism use cases. And even in those, the AI detectors can be evaded very easily, as some have looked at before. So it's complicated, but uh, there has not been any kind of convincing examination of detectors that would suggest that they be solid evidence as to whether or not someone has used AI in their own right.
Few other things to mention. It's not a research tool. If you're using ChatGPT purely as a search engine, yes, especially early on, that was not an ideal usage. However, this is changing slightly as these tools are connected more and more to the internet. And this also depends on the models that you're using. And if you're using it as a space to generate research questions or search terms, that then you go into a more retrieval augmented generation or some other tool that it can actually be helpful for research in certain ways. And then this last one we have here, prompt engineering matters. Well, this is changing actually, and you might remember back to like a hot minute a year or two ago when people were like, "Oh, prompt engineering is the new like everybody has to be a prompt engineer. That's their new career." Well, that was a flash in the pan, and now some of this thinking and the things that you need to interact with AI strategically are baked into the models already, and you'll see that kind of being spelled out as you're using some of the models that exist. I skipped over its bias because I want to take us to an image here. This is still true. There the challenge is there are many kinds of bias, and some of them are more overt than others. And so you don't know what you're going to get necessarily when you ask a particular question, but you can assume that because this data that trained these models has the presence of bias within it, of course, the models themselves will be prone to some forms of output bias. So I'll just show you an example. This is from Midjourney, which is an image creation source or AI. This top row says create an image of marketing professor teaching a class. Well, we get a sense of who or what types of folks can be marketing professors in this tool's sort of training data. Also, I asked it to make a photograph of a historian. I'm a historian for the record. And here are the images that apparently have to be in the Victorian era. That's the
It's like steampunk almost.
steampunk. Yeah. Um,
That's
Bob Vandemeyer might be pictured here. I don't know. I'm picking on Bob because he's on the call. So um, just some things to keep in mind there. So this is leading up to some of the things that Trey and I always talk about when we talk to people about generative AI is that these tools are constantly changing. So things that we say about them may change over the course of the next few days. If you're going to use it in class to teach something or show students something, test it that morning. It still might change on you between then and the time you use it in class. But there is no instruction manual, and the only way to stay conversant is to keep playing with the tools and trying them over time. And there are certainly concerns that still persist, and some of which become even more concerning over time. Concerns over ethics and the biases that are present in the outputs, the hallucinations, environmental impact. These are huge server farms, data farms that are, warming the earth. Concerns about privacy, concerns about intellectual property, all these persist. And so we're not suggesting to you that it's not fair to think about those. Like you should be thinking about those and thinking about when and how that matters when it's related to your use.
and these are
Probably
things like
go ahead, Trey.
that anecdotally that students care about these things too. And so for, asking students to use AI in classes or have conversations about AI in classes, these things are going to come up. It's not just going to be about the pedagogy or like whether or not it's okay for a student to like have AI draft a paper for them or something. Students are thinking about these impacts that AI have, whether it's impact on the earth, impact on the creative professions. They're thinking about, their own right to their own data. They're thinking about all these things. And so that will be a part of it for students too. It won't just be pedagogy.
Yeah. And then of course, the building of critical literacies around these tools is probably the most important thing that we can be working on right now with ourselves and our students. This requires experimentation, it requires curiosity, healthy skepticism. But to Bob's point in the chat, these tools do use up a lot of resources. And so thinking about when and if you want to use these in what context should include that conversation as well. Trey, we're running up on time, so would you be okay if we opened up for questions?
Yeah, why don't you just show what's in the slide deck so that they know what's there,
Okay.
the
Yes.
resources for
Yeah. So
questions.
we elaborated a bit on some hallucinations, what those are, and some studies. We elaborated a bit on AI and the environment, concerns about privacy, and then also some concerns, high-level concerns that educators are thinking through right now that you all might explore, and different activities that you might look into if you're looking for a way to think about AI in your teaching. We have a lot of resources available. In addition to the UK Advanced Guidelines, there are guidelines for how to set up your AI policy, which we suggest everyone have. Um, and then we also have some activities that you can use to get through or to learn more about generative AI. Or if you don't want to do it yourself, come over and we'll do it with you.
Yeah.
So you don't have to give the tools your data. I'll just give them my data for you. Okay. Here's the other events that we've got coming up in this series this semester, but let's pause for questions.
Yep.
I'm going to share out the slides right now. What are you all thinking about?
Like Reddit style, ask us anything.
Or conversely, what would you like to learn more about as we're thinking about future programming we've got this semester, but we would love to hear what you all want more of. And you can unmute or write in the chat. Yeah, Anne.
Hi, thank you so much for this information. And yesterday, I was having a conversation with fellow researchers from different universities, and it happened that one of them mentioned to analyze data, interview data that have been, what's the word?
Anonymized.
Anonymous, yeah, anonymized. And it became a place of concern to use ChatGPT to generate themes where it was an interview. So definitely we were going to use the data to generate thematics, ideas for our analyses. And it happened that one of us raised a matter of concern that because it was going to be data from people, even though they've been anonymized, it still is data from people. I don't know what you all think about that. How do we go about this in future? Since AI has come to stay, it makes work a lot easier and it goes a lot faster to color code line by line. What do we do?
Yeah, that's a tough question. But I think it's even harder when you've got a team of people because it's probably something you want to make sure you're agreeing on together early on. I have a bit of a conservative stance on this as a humanist and a qualitative researcher. Like a lot of my interpretations of qualitative data of words comes from a lot of the stuff that's in my brain. And I don't trust ChatGPT to do the job that I can do on that. And that's not just me saying that, it's also me running experiments with 14 weeks of ChatGPT data where I then asked ChatGPT to analyze it and then tell me, which tool did the best job for this thing. And then it does all these complicated things and says, oh, turns out ChatGPT was the best at it. And I said, well, but you are a ChatGPT. Might you be biased? And it runs through all these calculations again. And then it says, actually, Gemini was better. And I'm just like, okay, I don't know that I trust you. And it would take me weeks to sort of back check. So if you can replicate and go through and check and see, but if it's tool sets that exist within you and your own ways of thinking, then I am hesitant about how that is replicable with a tool. So happy to talk with you further on that, Trey.
Yeah, I'll just add that in my personal experience too, that replication is a big problem, and that's also part of the study that I linked to in the chat too, to where, I mean, I just took like qualitative information that we collect at CELT to try to code some of our like internal records around consultations, and it just kept giving me wildly different answers in terms of like, how many consultations had something to do with AI, how many consultations had, something to do with this. It would give me lots of different answers, and it really depended on my prompting. It depended on lots of different things. So the replicability is a huge issue. And you'd also asked about, even if the data is anonymized, I mean, I think Jill's stance is largely one that would be upheld by research integrity offices, that if it is protected research data, that it's better to use um, private, offline, or protected generative AI to analyze that data versus handing it over to an entity outside of your organization. And what I mean by that is that there are some open source models that people even install on local machines and protected servers. There's here at UK, we have access to Copilot that unfortunately is a pay for service, but it's a per user, per seat, FERPA and IRB compliant um, walled garden using Copilot that is a per user license. So, and then there's always the question of the methodology itself as to whether it's appropriate for the methodology too. So I think that's what a lot of researchers are thinking right now as to how appropriate and where it can work in the research process, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. Okay, so let me go back to Jonathan. I simply don't know how much students use AI and have a policy not to use it, but have no idea how widespread is the use among humanities undergraduates. Anecdotal evidence for how much they're using it and impact how they write. National surveys are showing that students are increasingly using it. I've seen numbers as high as 80% of students say that they use it. And but the interesting part is when you start asking students about what they think it's appropriate to use it for, and having it write papers for you, at least on their answers to the surveys, they will say that they don't think it's appropriate to have you write your papers for you. They'll say that it's appropriate to do research. They'll say that it's appropriate to, use for personal uses, organize your life, take notes, or summarize meetings, etc. But they tend to rate it kind of low in terms of writing your papers for you. But generally, most students are using it in some way, shape, or form.
I would
Thanks, Trey. I mean, I mean, at UK, has there been any particular surveys done at UK? I'm just reflecting the fact that in English, you visited us, Trey, and you raised some very interesting questions, and I just think there's a low-level anxiety about it among my faculty, and we don't necessarily know what to do about it, and we're not really sure how widespread it is. And I think, Jill, you said earlier, maybe you're pretending it's not there. I hope it goes away. We know it's not going away, but I do feel you know, we we just we just kind of at a loss to think about it clearly. And I don't think any of my colleagues have really eh, um, done a survey or anything like that. But I just wondered if people are coming to you with this as a problem. And over the last 2 semesters, I haven't had many problems with the writing. I mean, the students seem to be writing the way they write, but with one or two exceptions, which were blatant. But I feel that will change. And I guess I agree with you, Trey. They're probably using it, to just brainstorm, but not necessarily using it as a final submitted product. So that's just my hunch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well, and
thank you.
interestingly too, when we build activities into class where we're asking students to use AI as optional, I am having a
Yes.
hard time getting students to buy into those activities. Like I built out
Oh,
a tutor using Google Notebook LM for my War and Society class. Two students showed interest in it. Like Trey's been
really?
doing it in his classes where limited numbers of students are even interested. So I think I don't know that there is a way to get pure data on how many students are using
Yeah.
it and to what extent. So that's what makes it so
Yeah.
hard. But one of the things we often talk to folks about who come to us individually is conversation about assignment design. So if there's
Yeah.
definitely, if you're comfortable, put your assignment into ChatGPT, the free version, see what it does, and see if you're getting things that look similar.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's one of the steps that I would take. Also, if your students look like their grammar is really good and their sentence structure
Yeah.
on point, then I get really nervous. So I tell my students, like, I don't care if it's polished. I want to see your ideas. I don't care about ChatGPT's ideas. That seems to
That's
help.
it's a great
The
point.
the
Yeah.
rallying cry that I try to use is input, not output. It's
Yes.
not here for just producing the thing and making it kind of a transactional enterprise where, we have the piece of writing, but if it's a part of our workflow, and if it's a part of our thinking, which it will be likely in some way, just like the internet is irrevocably a part of my thinking as, a child of the
Yes.
80s, that I
Yes.
I always use the internet to think. And
Yes.
so in that way, it's sort of like a cyborg sort of situation. And
Right.
but for input in that sense, input into the project, into my ideas, rather than using it for output. But I mean, for writing based assessment, that's one of the big, billion trillion dollar questions. And there's different levers to pull and practices and principles, but we're still figuring it out for sure.
Craig,
Thank you.
comment on,
That's really
oh,
helpful. Yeah.
sorry,
Thank
John.
you.
Can you comment on Bob's question there about
Oh,
what
here we go. Has there
was
been any discussions at the university level to provide funds or access to paid AI counselor? Not at the university level, Bob. I know that at some colleges they have been doing that, particularly for the Copilot accounts, but potentially also for ChatGPT Plus or similar accounts, but not at the university level yet.
Just to reiterate, we're around all the time if you all want to talk through challenges or ideas. A lot of the free versions are really powerful right now, so don't feel like if you don't have access to a paid version that you can't have meaningful interaction with AI. So those are all things to think about. But let us know if we can help. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.